Hello everyone. I'll be reading my summary notes for the Scrum Guide 2020. Please know that this is not the entire Scrum Guide. It is a quick reference material that I use to brush up my overall concept. It by no means is comprehensive and it should be used only as a supplement to the Scrum Guide 2020. If you have not yet heard my Scrum Guide audio, you can find its link in the video description below. Please visit and give it a thumbs up if you like it. Let's get started. Scrum. It's based on empiricism, lean thinking, and is iterative. It optimizes predictability, controls risk, guides relationships and interactions. The 5 values of Scrum are focus, respect, openness, courage, and commitment. Together, these values build trust. The 3 pillars of Scrum are transparency, inspection, and adaptation. The 3 artifacts of Scrum are product backlog, sprint backlog, and definition of done. The 5 Scrum events are sprint, under which we have sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. When multiple Scrum teams work on the same product, it's called a scaled Scrum. The outcome, which is satisfaction of customers and employees, is more important than the output, the functionality. Now let's move on to some keywords. Transparency. Transparency reflects in the state of the 3 Scrum artifacts. Inspection. Scrum events provide the opportunity to inspect and provide feedback loop. Adaptation. If a process deviates from the acceptable limits, adjustments are made as soon as possible. Adaptation becomes difficult when people involved are not empowered or self-managing. Focus. Team's primary focus is on the work of the sprint to make progress towards the goal. Scrum Team. The Scrum Team consists of 1 Scrum Master, 1 Product Owner, and 10 or fewer developers. There are no hierarchies or sub-teams. The teams are cross-functional and self-managing, which is who does what, when, and how is decided by the team. The team is focused on one objective at a time, that is the product goal. The team is responsible for all product-based activities. The team works at a sustainable pace and it helps to ensure focus and consistency. The entire team is responsible for creating a valuable increment every sprint. The team can have meetings outside of Scrum events. The role of team members are not job titles. Scrum Guide calls them accountabilities. Any change in Scrum team results in decrease in velocity or productivity. Developers. They are committed to creating an increment. They are accountable for sprint backlog, adhering to the definition of done, sprint plan, adapting the plan to reach the sprint goal through daily Scrum, and holding each other accountable, which is self-managing. Developers provide sprint forecast and size the PBI, which is product backlog item. Decomposing PBI to smaller tasks of 1 day or less is done solely by the developers. Developers do the sizing, but product owner can influence by explaining the requirements in more detail. Developers attend daily Scrum. Product owner or Scrum Master can attend if they are working on the backlog items as developers. The developers can choose the structure for daily Scrum as long as it focuses on the sprint goal. All developers are accountable for an outcome even if single developer implements an item. They are responsible for monitoring progress during a sprint, which means they are self-managing. Product owner. They are accountable for maximizing the value of the product, which is the main responsibility. Always the best answer in quiz. Accountable for product backlog management, creating a product goal, ordering product backlog items, ensuring product backlog is transparent, clear, and visible and can be communicated clearly. May delegate their responsibility who may or may not be part of the team but remains accountable, has to attend Scrum events himself. Product owner collaborates with stakeholders and represents their need in product backlog. Stakeholders can influence, but final say is with the product owner. To change the product backlog, you need to convince the product owner, even if it's the CEO who wants to change the product backlog. His decisions are reflected in the order and sizing of the product backlog item and in the inspectable increments at sprint review. Only product owner can cancel a sprint. They collaborate with developers to negotiate the scope of the sprint backlog, and they are responsible for product planning and managing products with agility. Scrum Master is accountable for team's effectiveness, establishing Scrum at organization and team level. They coach about Scrum, they facilitate meetings if conflict arises, helps remove impediments, ensures all Scrum events are positive, productive, and time boxed. They help product owner in goal setting, in PBI management, product planning, and stakeholders collaboration. They help with Scrum implementation, and they help with understanding the empirical approach. They help with team effectiveness by enabling the team improve practices within the Scrum framework. They are considered a management position in Scrum but is different from the traditional manager. They lead, coach, train, facilitate, and remove impediments. Scrum Events. Scrum Events are opportunity to inspect and adapt. They provide feedback loop and they are held at the same place and time to reduce complexity. Sprint. Sprint is typically for 1 month or less. That is called as time boxed for a month or less. Attended by team and stakeholders and any other invitees. They ensure predictability. New sprint starts immediately after the conclusion of the previous one. During the sprint, no changes to sprint goal or quality occurs. Product backlog is refined. Scope may be negotiated with the product owner. With long sprints, goals can become invalid and complexity and risk may increase. Shorter sprints minimize risk of cost and effort and increase learning. Sprint can be cancelled if goals become obsolete. Only product owner can cancel the sprint. Even if the sprint is cancelled, review and retrospective meetings are held to discuss the done work. The end result of a sprint is an increment. The length of a sprint is fixed and is not a topic of discussion during the sprint planning meeting. There are no sprint zero or release sprint, etc. in sprint. Scrum does not approve of working overtime to complete a sprint. Sprint planning. It's time boxed to 8 hours. It's shorter for shorter sprints. It's attended by the Scrum team and those invited by the team as advisors. There are no stakeholders in the meeting. The invitees at the meeting can provide input and advice but not tell the team what and how to do it. Inputs for the meetings are past performance, upcoming capacity, definition of done, and product backlog. Output of the meeting is the sprint backlog that has the selected PBIs, a plan, and a sprint goal. Sprint goal should be specific, measurable, and flexible enough to adjust scope. Not all PBIs selected needs to contribute towards the sprint goal. Some of those can be fix, improvements, and PBIs from previous sprint. The sprint goal must be finalized prior to the end of the sprint planning. It answers the following questions. Why is the sprint valuable, which is the goal? What can be done, which is the selected PBIs, and how it can be done, which is the plan. Only developers forecast, size, and plan the work with inputs from the product owner. Developers break down the PBI into smaller work of 1 day or less. How this is done is at the sole discretion of the developers. As long as the planning meeting has not ended, it is possible to change the sprint goal. Daily Scrum. It's time boxed to 15 minutes. Only developers attend the daily Scrum. If there's an outsider, like the Scrum Master, product owner, or other expert, they attend only if they are working on the items in the sprint backlog. During the meeting, they inspect progress, plan the work for the next 24 hours, and adapt the sprint backlog as needed. It helps to improve communication, identify impediments, and quick decision making. Developers can decide structure and technique of the meeting as long as it focuses on the goal. Developers can meet outside of the Scrum events as well and collaborate with stakeholders anytime they need to. Sprint review. It's time boxed to 4 hours. It's shorter for shorter sprints. It's attended by the team and key stakeholders. Progress towards a product goal, not the sprint goal, is discussed. Purpose is to inspect the increment, adapt the product backlog, and what to do next to get them closer to the product goal. Future adaptations, that is, adjusting the product backlog, are based on what has changed in the environment. It should not be limited to a presentation. An increment can also be released before the sprint review. If the team has released multiple increments, only the last increment is reviewed since it's built upon the previous ones. If a fix or improvement is identified by stakeholders, it can be taken up in the next sprint and released immediately. Sprint retrospective. It's time boxed to 3 hours. It's shorter for shorter sprints. It's attended by Scrum Team only because external participants will prohibit team to discuss issues freely. It looks at ways to increase quality and effectiveness. It discusses how last sprint went with respect to interactions, individuals, tools, definition of done, and processes, as well as assumptions that led them to deviate. Most impactful improvements identified can be added to sprint backlog for next sprint. It's the best time to adapt the definition of done. The development process is inspected during sprint retrospective. Please refer to the table on the screen for a short representation of the various sprint events, the time box, and the attendees related to them. Let's go on to the next topic, the Scrum Artifacts. Scrum Artifacts represents work or value. It maximizes transparency. Each artifact contains a commitment. For product backlog, it's the product goal. For sprint backlog, it's the sprint goal. And for an increment, it's the definition of done. Product backlog. It's an emergent ordered list updated throughout the sprint. It is managed by the product owner. It's a single source of work undertaken by the team. Product backlog items that can be done by the team within one sprint are deemed ready for selection. Product backlog refinement breaks down the product backlog item into smaller items. This makes the product backlog more transparent. Product backlog refinement is an ongoing activity that adds details like description, value, order, size, and acceptance criteria to each item. It can happen throughout the sprint. Developers do the sizing, done in story points. Product owners can influence the sizing. Product owner does the ordering. Scrum Guide does not recommend any tool for handling product backlog. Product goal is the future state of product. It's a long-term objective for the team. Product is a vehicle to deliver value. Team must fulfill or abandon a goal before taking on a new one. Sprint backlog. It's created during sprint planning. It's managed by developers. It can be modified in collaboration with the product owner. It's updated throughout the sprint. Sprint backlog items are the same as PBI. It's an examination question that you often get. Developers need to select items from the top of the product backlog and add to sprint backlog. They cannot do random selection. Unfinished items from sprint backlog are put back into product backlog. It has a plan by and for the developers. It should have enough detail that they can be inspected in daily Scrum. It can be negotiated without affecting quality and goal. Sprint goal, single objective for the sprint, should be flexible enough to provide flexibility in the work needed to be done. It creates focus and coherence for the team as all of them work towards the same goal. It does not change during the sprint. It needs to be created by the end of the sprint planning meeting. Increment. It's a stepping stone towards product goal. In order to provide value, it should be usable and meet the definition of done. It should work with all the previous increments. Multiple increments can be created in a single sprint. The sum of increments is presented at the review, thus supporting empiricism. Increments can be presented to stakeholders prior to the end of the sprint. It is released by the product owner in collaboration with the team. Developers must create at least one increment per sprint. If no increment is created in the sprint, no value has been created. Definition of done. It's a formal description of the state of an increment when it meets the quality criteria. It represents a shared understanding of what complete work is. Scrum Guide does not have a format for definition of done or define a meeting to create a definition of done. It creates transparency. When a product backlog item meets the definition of done, an increment is created. If the organization has a definition of done, team uses that. If it does not have one, team creates one. A definition of done should be created during the first sprint planning event before the development work begins. If there are multiple teams working on the same product, they have a mutually decided same definition of done. Initial definition of done is not final. It can be adapted during the sprint retrospective. Definition of done versus acceptance criteria. Definition of done applies to every PBI and increment. Acceptance criteria is different for each PBI. Definition of done is created by the team. Acceptance criteria is created by the product owner. Definition of done is mandatory. Acceptance criteria is optional. Scaled team. It has a single product goal, product backlog, definition of done, and product owner. It can have different Scrum Master and different sprint backlog. It minimizes cross-team dependencies. Teams create an integrated increment, not an individual increment per team. Teams can have different sprint length, different start and end dates. A feature team works on a feature and hence it's cross-functional and cross-component. A component team works on a single component or layer and is not cross-functional. Glossary. Velocity. It is the amount of work a team can handle during a sprint. It is not connected to product value. Burn down chart. It is the amount of work left to do. Burn up chart is the amount of work completed. Technical debt. It impacts velocity and quality and reduces transparency. Thanks for listening to my summary of Scrum Guide 2020. I hope you score excellent in your Scrum examination. All the best.